This interview contains the sound of an air raid siren. Please don't be alarmed.
I make mistakes every day, but I'm not wrong on this issue. Horrifically imposing a partial arms embargo on an ally while it's fighting a seven-front war. Sanctioning ministers in a friendly government, democratic government, never been done before. I served in the British Army for 30 years. The Palestinians do not want a two-state solution. And some of the statements that are made by the likes of Keir Starmer and David Lammy, it's all about domestic politics. We are by far the net beneficiary of any exchange or any arms trade between the two countries, by far. But when the truth begins to come out about Gaza and what's happened in Gaza, I think a different story might emerge.
Do you realise how weird that makes you sound?
They may disbelieve me, but everything I say is based on carefully researched fact. I think a sense of unity and patriotism, which I think has certainly not been fostered for many, many years, should be an element of Britishness.
If something like that were to happen to us, you'd see people getting on the first flight out.
These people sitting in 10 Downing Street don't have the courage to stand up and use these forces. When I say that, people say, oh, but that's the end of NATO. Well, yes, it would be the end of NATO. I was taught to hate my country.
I'm Jonathan Sacerdoti. Colonel Richard Kemp, thanks for joining me here in Tel Aviv.
My pleasure, Jonathan. Great to be with you.
You seem to be out in Israel at all the right moments. What do you know that the rest of us don't?
I can't possibly tell you. No, I spend a lot of time in Israel, and I've been here for most of the time since the 7th of October. I actually arrived on the 9th. I've been in and out, but I've been here. I've spent most of my time here in order to be able to get the best possible picture of what's happening. It's one thing to look at the internet or read a newspaper or something. It's another thing to actually see it with your own eyes.
I find that because the version of what's going on here being told back in the UK is almost unrecognisable to me compared to what I actually see happening here. Do you find the same?
Absolutely the same. And not just the UK, but also in certainly most of Western Europe and in some places in the United States. The reality is that I think not many people may understand is that Israel is deemed to be, by the popular narrative, is deemed to be illegitimate. It stole Arab land. It practices apartheid. It's a genocidal state. It has illegal settlements and illegal occupation. That is the narrative. Obviously, all complete lies. But that narrative began in the 1960s, and it actually originated in the Soviet Union. And it's developed over those decades since the 60s into a situation where, because of this illegitimacy of Israel and its evils, whatever happens to Israel, it had it coming to it. And whatever Israel does to defend itself, it's in the wrong. And that is the narrative that is kind of behind pretty much all of the picture that people in the UK, most people in the UK get, particularly if they watch something like the BBC or Sky News.
Do you realise how weird that makes you sound to people in Britain who hear you say that?
I'm sure I do. I'm sure I'm weird in many different ways, but I've been involved in Israel and the Middle East for many, many years. When I was working in the Prime Minister's office in the UK, for example, one of my responsibilities was studying, from the intelligence perspective, was studying the Israel-Palestine situation and Middle East conflict generally. And so even though people in the UK may think it's weird, it's based on, I think, a fairly deep understanding and direct experience. I've been here in this country many, many times. I've been here pretty much for during, shall I say, every war that has been fought between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. So they may disbelieve me, but everything I say is based on carefully researched fact.
And does that disbelief, that misperception of what's going on here extend to the top? You said, you've been at the top levels of British military and intelligence, and do you see the same lack of recognition there, or do they actually get it?
No, I think they get it. And during my time in the Cabinet Office, I worked for Tony Blair and for Gordon Brown. Both of those two certainly got it. I'm sure that Keir Starmer gets it. I'm sure he understands. I don't have any doubt about that. But their reactions to this situation are based, for example, horrifically imposing a partial arms embargo on an ally while it's fighting a seven-front war. Sanctioning ministers in a friendly government, a democratic government, never been done before. And some of the statements that are made by the likes of Keir Starmer and David Lammy and others, this has nothing to do with Israel, in my opinion. It's all about domestic politics. It's all about appeasing the significant base of support for the current government, for the Labour Party, that is very anti-Israel. That's what it's all about. And when you hear people like Keir Starmer talking about Gaza, for example, I spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu. I emphasised to him how important it is that he minimises the deaths of civilians, takes all possible precautions. He knows, when he says that, he knows exactly what the IDF is doing in Gaza. He's got people over here. He's got military attachés. He's got other people. They know exactly what's happening. He knows that Israel's taking the maximum precautions, but he has to say that in order to placate his base. And the problem with it is, I say he has to say it, he doesn't have to say it, but he chooses to say it. The problem with it is that when you say Israel must take maximum precautions, it means they're not. That's what it means. And what that does is to give ammunition to the anti-Israel mobs and the Jew haters in the UK. It fuels their fire and makes it worse. And it's completely the wrong approach, because the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister and every other government minister have a direct responsibility. They don't necessarily have to echo everything that Israel says by any means, but they do have a direct responsibility to make sure the truth gets out there, to help protect the Jews in their own population, who are, as you know better than I do, are at grave risk and have been at even graver risk since this war began.
Your allegation there is that Keir Starmer is chosen to know what's going on, and he's chosen to bully the allied country that is having to deal with it in a way that is in fact legitimate, legal, and taking care of humanitarian needs at their weakest moment, purely for his own pragmatic benefit as a politician. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely that, for domestic purposes. For example, he's saying that when he says that we're withholding these arms to Israel, the only thing that can mean is because Israel's using them for unlawful purposes, yet he knows it's not true. It's performative, it's virtue signaling, and I think above all, it's playing to his own political supporters. And so it's by the way, that's not, as you know, that's not unique to Keir Starmer. This is the way that many politicians behave. And since this war began, I've spent a lot of time in meetings with political leaders from many different countries, from the United States, UK, European countries, Australia, South Africa, trying to explain to them the reality of what's going on over here. And many of them, privately behind closed doors, they don't necessarily agree with me, but it's very clear that they don't disagree either. Their actions, and you take Australia as an example, the terrible actions of Australia, which used to be one of the staunchest allies of Israel, nothing whatever to do with the reality. Facts actually these days very often just don't matter, even to the top level political leaders.
You're an insider. You have these conversations. You have a better idea than most of what the politicians do know and don't know, and why they're behaving as they do. So to play devil's advocate, to give them the benefit of the doubt, if they weren't to behave that way, if they were to stand up for the truth and boldly in support of what Israel's doing, what would happen to them politically?
Well, potentially they could pay a significant political price. I'm talking particularly now about the Labour Party, which is effectively, it's Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. Yes, it's been given a new coat of paint, but it's still the fundamental kind of anti-Semitic streak within the Labour Party is still there. I would say there's every probability that if Keir Starmer and David Lammy stood up and did what they thought was right, they would certainly suffer for that. You just have to look at the way the party is plunging in the polls at the moment. Yes, there's not an election for a few years. They've got to bear that in mind, though. They've got to make sure that the party is electable in a few years' time. Yet they've got not only kind of reform biting at their heels, but they've also got, I think we saw it for the first time at the last election, activist Muslim political parties standing on a anti-Israel platform, and that gives them very good reason to be fearful that this will expand before the next election. I think one of the reasons why this phenomenon occurred for the first time at that election was because Starmer was not sufficiently anti-Israel in the run-up to the election. I think by and large, I was quite impressed actually by him, because I thought he followed a pretty strong government line, a conservative government line, which was pretty strongly in support of it. It was not strong enough, but pretty strongly. And I think he paid maybe a small price at the election, but nevertheless a price that he doesn't want to pay again.
You must know from your experience of the actual close collaboration and connection between Israel and the UK and other Western players, how many times Israel has actually saved lives in Britain, has given intelligence that has helped to foil terror plots, all of those sorts of things. Why do you feel or think Britain and other countries react, let's say, so ungratefully in response to what is effectively an ally that is on the front line of the exact same battle that Britain is not only going to face, but is basically facing now?
Yeah, I mean, on that, the first part of what you were saying there, I know from direct personal experience that Israeli intelligence...
That's a missile warning.
So you've got half an hour or
Shall we?
so.
Well, we usually have good 10, 15 minutes. If you want to carry on, I'm happy to.
I'm happy to, yeah.
Okay, good. So yes, sorry, one of the occupational hazards of being out here at the moment, but I suppose that's a good example. This is a country that's put in place this extraordinary warning system. We now have a warning for the warning to the extent that you and I can keep talking. It's a country that's really figured out how to deal with these drastic problems that really are facing or beginning to face all of us. It should be an example rather than a pariah.
Absolutely, and it is an example to us. And let me tell you that many generals from different countries around the world, including the United States and from Arab countries, have been here during the wars. I'm talking about since the 7th of October. They've come here to learn the way that Israel does business. And before that, there were many occasions when generals from different countries around the world came to do the same thing in previous conflicts. And while, for example, the German government, I think it was, during one of the earlier Gaza conflicts, was lambasting Israel for not taking enough care of innocent civilian lives inside Gaza, at the same time, a delegation, including a serving German general, was here learning about how the Israelis do it. I wouldn't describe it as hypocrisy. It is probably hypocrisy, but I think it's political expediency, which takes precedence over doing the right thing. And I was just mentioning before that I know from direct personal experience that how the Israeli intelligence, Israeli technology, Israeli sharing of knowledge and information has saved many, many British lives. And just to give you one example of that, when I was in Afghanistan, it was the first time, this was back in 2003, first time I had experienced or had to deal with suicide terrorism. Plenty of other different types of terrorism before that, not suicide terrorism. The Israelis sent their number one expert from Israel to London to brief me on exactly what the IDF do dealing with suicide terrorism. That became British Army doctrine and later NATO doctrine. They sent this guy specifically to come and see me. That one action saved many, many lives. And there are plenty of other examples I could give you in relation to specific intelligence. One other example, which is not in my time working in this world, but occurred more recently in 2015, there was an Iranian cell in London trying to set up an explosives factory to carry out terrorist attacks in the UK, which was interdicted by our intelligence services on the basis of intelligence given to them by Israel. Just one example of many, many I could give you.
And yet what we see now that Israel is taking on the Islamic Republic of Iran is this, let's say, hesitation on the part of Great Britain to actually fully and wholeheartedly endorse Israel's actions and to stand behind Israel, at the very least, to just say, yes, we support this. Yes, Israel is correct to operate in this way. And that is even after, you're telling me, Britain has saved lives of Britons with intelligence from Israel, specifically from attacks from the Islamic Republic.
Yeah, absolutely. And the British approach to this has been, I think, disgraceful. It actually, interestingly enough, mirrors the Russian approach. The Kremlin has told Israel to stand down, to basically de-escalate the situation because they're so concerned about loss of life. And the British government, those are the words of the British government as well. You think actually that the Prime Minister of Great Britain might think he was saying something wrong if it was the same as what the Russians were saying. But this idea of de-escalation. You had the G7 in Canada yesterday. I think they made a statement saying, we have always said Iran must not have a nuclear weapon. But what have they done? They've done nothing. They've just handed it over to Israel. Let Israel deal with it. And meanwhile, we'll criticize Israel. So if they're determined that Iran mustn't have a nuclear weapon, then this is the last time to be de-escalating. This is the time to urge Israel to do more, to do what they can to help Israel to do more, to get rid of this nuclear weapons threat, which doesn't just threaten Israel, it threatens the whole of the Middle East, and it threatens our country and the whole of Europe as well.
I think now it's time to go into the... Well, as well as home from command, I will get in trouble with my mum.
Whatever you tell me.
You're the colonel, but I'm just a mere journalist. Let's pop down and we'll come back up in a few minutes. We're back now after a brief interlude in the shelter downstairs. Perhaps it's a good way to get back into what we were talking about, because Israel's facing this as a very real challenge in terms of actual war, ballistic missiles incoming, people dying. And yet Europe, the UK, America are really fighting the same battle, according to Israelis, but it's not necessarily in the form of ballistic missiles yet. We've had terror incidents, and it does seem to many people that society around them is changing. And we've talked about how politicians perhaps feel they can't stand up for what they really believe is right because of demographic change or change in their voters' attitudes. So do you think there's a way around this, a way out of this? How can Britain, say, learn from Israel?
Well, Britain can learn in military terms and in security terms, and the more kind of technical stuff can learn a hell of a lot from Israel. How it can learn from Israel in terms of experience, I think there's plenty of lessons, in terms of resilience, shall we say, I think there's plenty of lessons that our countries can learn from this. But it's a question whether they're willing to learn it. And I mentioned, I think before, that America and other countries have sent generals to learn from Israel. I think Britain's been particularly reluctant to do that because Britain, particularly with the current British government, they don't want to be seen to be aligned with Israel too closely. So it's a question of how willing they are to learn lessons. And you hear things like, people are very deeply concerned about what's going on in Ukraine and the risks that presents for, greater aggression against NATO countries, etc., by Putin. And therefore, we must build up our army. We must spend 3.5% or something on defense, which is highly inadequate, but nevertheless. But the question you have to ask, Ben, is once you spend that money and maybe you've got that equipment, how do you get people to actually use it? There's actually been no motivation, no patriotism kind of pushed forward by any recent government, which should inspire and motivate people to be ready to fight for their country. I don't think it would take much in the way of leadership, but again, that leadership is not there and is probably unlikely to come. And even more important than that, or at least as important than that and connected, is political will. Deterrence, but by far the most important function of military forces is deterrence, because it's much better to deter a conflict than to actually have to fight it. But deterrence is not based only on military capability, it's also based upon political will, which is probably more important. And I simply don't think that political will is there. And no matter how big an armed forces, say the UK, developed, I don't think it would be much of a deterrent, because the likes of Putin would think, well, they're not going to use it. These people sitting in 10 Downing Street don't have the courage to stand up and use these forces. And I think he's probably, if he thinks that, I think he's probably right. And that's another lesson that maybe they could, I know it's probably a kind of verboten thing to say, but, they need to look at the way that Netanyahu has run this war, which I think is pretty flawless since the 7th of October. And he's shown the most extraordinary leadership in the face of so many different challenges. And I think that, political leaders could well learn a great deal from him.
I spoke to a British former soldier who told me that he didn't believe that if an October the 7th happened in the UK, we would see the same thing as Israel saw, which is young Israelis flying back from wherever they were in the world in order to be here, to go into service and to fight. In fact, I think that if something like that were to happen to us, you'd see people getting on the first flight out. So not just politicians, but do you not think perhaps the population is not in any way ready to stand up and fight for whatever might be at threat in our society?
I do think that, but I think it comes down to leadership. None of this sort of stuff happens just by chance. It's a great deal of it depends upon political leadership. And that extends not just to kind of, stirring speeches by the Prime Minister, but it also includes what kids are taught in schools and what kids are taught at universities. And when I was at school many, many years ago, I was taught to hate my country, that I was a wicked colonialist, I was a racist, I was a slave trader, all of these things. And unless that kind of narrative is shifted, then it's very hard to understand why people would want to stand up and defend this racist country or this slave trading country. And again, that comes down to political leadership. As far as individuals are concerned, I served in the British Army for 30 years and served alongside very large numbers of young men, particularly men, but a few women as well. I was in the infantry and there weren't women in the infantry at the time, but just ordinary kids out of a council estate in a big city who were faced with some of the most monumental challenges anyone could be faced with, and actually met those challenges and met them very, very effectively. And there are stories of, there was talk of the PlayStation generation in Iraq or Afghanistan, where you couldn't rely on these kids to fight like their forebears had, because they were just obsessed with the screen and all the rest of it. Some extraordinary examples of sheer heroism among 18, 19-year-old kids fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the raw material is there, in my opinion. Yes, of course, these were all volunteers, as we only have volunteers in the British Army. But the raw material exists and can be shaped and molded in the interests of the country if the political leaders choose to do so.
So do you think it's time maybe for Britain and other countries which don't currently to have conscription again, for a compulsory conscription?
I don't think that's necessary at the moment. I recognise the British Armed Forces are low on manning. They're not able to recruit enough people. I think that's not because there aren't the people who are willing to serve, but it's because the recruiting system doesn't work, simply doesn't work, and could be made to work. But what I do think, I think certainly conscription would be beneficial to young people for their, for the rest of their lives and for their whole lives, not just learning military skills, learning teamwork, discipline, and all these sort of things. But I do think that it's time certainly to expand things like cadet forces and scouts and organizations like that, which do, hopefully still today, I don't know, instill these kind of values into young people.
I think that's what I meant, in a sense, not just the human resources for the armed forces themselves, but I think, tell me if you agree, I believe Israel has created a society which is very cohesive in some ways, despite divisions or disagreements, largely through compulsory conscription, because people here meet each other at the age of 18 from vastly different backgrounds. As you say, it could be, in the British language, someone from a council estate meets somebody from a private school, meets somebody who's going to go on to be a medical doctor, somebody who's a mechanic, a doctor, a nurse, an artist. They all end up in the same place and meet each other. And in a sense, it creates a vision of what the nation actually is and a sense of unity and brotherhood, which I would say is very much missing in 2025 Britain. Is that an assessment you would recognise?
Yeah, I would certainly. And I know very few people of the thousands and thousands I've served with over the years in the British Army, very few who haven't benefited immensely from military service. And they enter as some kind of young thug out off the streets, and they turn into not just a very good soldier, but also very good and upstanding member of society. And many, many people I've seen go through that process. So I think I don't say it's in itself is a necessary process. I think it'd be a useful process. I think the change elsewhere in society, particularly in education, university and schools and youth organizations, I think would serve at least a part of that. But I agree with you totally that that the Israeli experience of compulsory service for pretty much everybody has made this country what it is. I don't say it's not a good thing that Israel has to have such a large army to defend itself. It would be better if it didn't, but there are benefits of that, and those benefits include pretty much everything you see about the miracle that is Israel today. I think that a lot of that stems from military service. And I also believe that Israel's going to come out of this war much stronger than it went in for a number of different reasons. And one of those reasons is because generations of Israelis, young and old, have made immense sacrifices, whether they're in the forces or on the home front, enormous sacrifices, some of whom losing their lives or losing their limbs for their country. And history shows us, I think, that when a country goes through that traumatic but in some ways inspiring process, I think it strengthens it.
That's very interesting. And I would say that from my experience of Israelis, it's absolutely true, both before October the 7th and even more so since, that it has this unifying effect and it creates a sense of purpose. And I think there's nothing that quite distills a nation's sense of purpose, values and ideals as those things being challenged. So in a way, maybe, I've grown up in Britain my whole life, lived there, and I think many Brits would struggle to tell you what Britishness really is these days. For you, as somebody that knows Israel well and that, again, served the country as you did, what do you think Britishness is?
Well, I think Britishness is something that you cannot define today, because it's, we have such a diverse society with such a huge range of origins and range of views that anything that really was Britishness is been severely diluted, at least. But I think there are obviously, and the kind of ideals of Britishness are not unique to Britain either. They're probably fairly common among most liberal democratic societies, and of course they should include patriotism, a willingness to serve your country and to do for your country what the country needs you to do, as well as working in your own interests, which obviously tends to predominate these days. So I think a sense of unity and patriotism, which I think has certainly not been fostered for many, many years, should be an element of Britishness. And I think, a sense of reasonableness and of fair play, fairness, I suppose, generally. These are some of the hallmarks of what it means to be British. But I think I would place the kind of a national spirit of some sort, which has been discouraged. I would place that probably close to the top. And that's why, we had people in the First and Second World War. We had people who, I think that we've recently passed the anniversary of D-Day, and the youngest British soldier to land on the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944 was 16. He'd lied about his age because, of course, he wasn't really allowed to be there till 18. And he was not unique. There were plenty of others in that war and in the previous war. I think the youngest person that served in the First War was somewhere like 13 or 14. These are not people who are obviously not compelled to do it. They have to work hard in order to do it. But I think, there was no shortage, certainly in the early days of the First and the Second World War, of people who were desperate to go and fight for their country and to serve their country. I'm not quite sure you'd see the same thing. I may be wrong about that, because we haven't been in that situation for a long time. But for example, my own great-grandfather, he served in the trenches in the First World War, albeit very briefly, because he was killed soon after he got there. But he fought. He was in reserved occupation. He wasn't allowed to join the forces. But he fought tooth and nail against the system to get himself into the trenches. And I think that's the kind of spirit that kind of, I'd say, epitomizes Britain.
It's a vicious cycle, though, because the less we know what it is we stand for, and the more it is, as you say, diluted, the less likely we are as a nation to stand up and fight to protect it. And so you end up with the situation like this former soldier I mentioned, who said, he said, I'm not sure I would want to fight anymore in the way that I did, because I don't recognize what it is that I was fighting to protect. So how do you break that cycle? At what point do leaders, politicians, or societal leaders intervene?
Well, it's a long process. There's no doubt about it. You can't just suddenly decide to reinstill a sense of patriotism, a sense of duty into young people just overnight. It's a process that takes a long time, and it as I said before, it's kind of leadership from the top, and a firm hand on the way that children are taught at school, the way that that universities operate, and the way that the armed forces is obviously a key part of all this. The way the armed forces are seen. When I was serving in the army, on many occasions we were trying to get military teams, 2 or 3 people, to go into schools in the UK to give an awareness of what the armed forces are all about to school children, and very often the schools simply rejected out of hand. You can't come here with your army stuff. And even at universities today, I think on some of the freshers' fairs and the like, most clubs in the universities set up their stands to encourage students to join. And I'm aware of a number of cases where the officer training corps, like the cadet organization at universities, have been excluded from those things. So all of this is so much to turn around, and it will take a very long time if it ever happens, and it will take a very strong leader, if there is one anywhere near. I haven't seen any.
And if it doesn't happen, what's the future hold?
Well, I think, there's, it suggests a potential breakdown in society, broken down into kind of clans, if you want, or into interest groups, which obviously is one of the main agendas, particularly on the left in the UK, of identity politics. You don't want people to coalesce. You want them to separate into their own, whatever their own interest or identity might be. We've seen a huge amount of that. If that isn't addressed, then I think you will see a rapid breakdown in cohesion in society. And when it comes to defense, it's almost an impossibility, I think, without addressing this. It's an impossibility to be in a position to defend ourselves. And just look at the reaction of Keir Starmer to Israel defending itself and the world against the Iranian nuclear threat. We've discussed it, but just look at that as an example. And I've been saying this for a long time now, and I hope I'm wrong, but I don't believe that if we're a member of NATO, UK is a member of NATO, supposedly the greatest defense alliance that's ever existed, I would be very surprised if, let's say, after Putin's finished what he wants to do in Ukraine and decides next he licks his wounds, he takes a bit of time, and then he has a bite at a NATO country like Poland or Romania, the Baltic states. I would be very surprised if any of the leaders of Western European countries, including the UK, are willing to send their young men and women to fight for a country that no one's ever heard of in Eastern Europe. And when I say that, people say, "Oh, but that's the end of NATO." Well, yes, it would be the end of NATO. It would prove that NATO actually was a paper tiger, and it's shown that. NATO's shown itself to be that to an extent already in Ukraine. Can you imagine the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, or whoever his successors are, saying, "Yes, I'm going to send young British men and women to go and fight against Russia in Poland at the risk of losing maybe even thousands or tens of thousands a day"? It simply isn't going to happen, in my opinion.
Is that because of the same need to satisfy their electorate that you mentioned earlier in terms of Britain's support for Israel or lack thereof?
I think that comes into it, but it's also, I think Western European countries and their politicians, really pretty much after the Cold War ended, they thought that was the end, pretty much the end of any need to fight and defend the country. And it's just gone outside their kind of psyche, completely outside. The idea that you'd have to stand up and fight for something as opposed to compromise and have negotiations and all the rest of it, I think has just disappeared across Europe. And that's why I say, in my opinion, they're simply not going to do that. That's just outside their mentality. What's the reaction to Israel attacking Iran? de-escalate. The wrong thing to do, totally the wrong thing to do.
Well, thank goodness it doesn't seem Israel's listening to that sort of advice. And I'm curious then who you think it is that they're trying to satisfy in society. Who is it that Keir Starmer is afraid of in his electorates?
Like I said, his party is Jeremy Corbyn's party. And I don't say this applies to every single Labour voter or Labour politician. And I know many Labour politicians and voters who do not share this view. But I think the view is that it's a significant Muslim vote, a very important vote in many cities. And there's no way, in my opinion, that you can get the majority of Muslims to back somebody who's standing up for Israel. There's absolutely no way. And then you have the many elements of the left, which obviously is the main supporters of the Labour Party, many elements of that which have coalesced with this same view. And there's utter hatred for Israel. And it's not just in the Labour Party. I'm sure there are people in the Conservative Party as well who feel this way, and probably Reform, I don't know.
Do you think there's behind this also Jew hatred or anti-Semitism, that there is a sense that Britain has harboured within it a sort of low-level animosity or discrimination against Jews, and here we are, perfect opportunity for it to come to the fore?
I think Jew hatred, Israel hatred, which are, in my view, one and the same thing, is absolutely present. I think there's much less anti-Semitism among the indigenous British population than existed before. I think that's far less. But it's been what anti-Semitism exists there now has been motivated by basically the Muslim population. And I would say, I haven't got scientific proof of this, I would say that the majority of Muslims in the UK or anywhere around the world have been brought up from a very early age to hate Israel. They absolutely hate it. And those people who stand up for Israel, they also hate, because it's pretty much for the same reason. If I get a car to take me from my home to Heathrow Airport, very often there'll be a Muslim driving the car, and he'll say to me, "Where are you going? Where are you flying to?" I say, "Israel." That results in one of two things only. One is a kind of monologue of hatred against Israel, and secondly, just silence. You'll never hear another word from him. And that's not occasionally, that's the way it always happens. And there are plenty of other examples of that. And it is an indoctrination. I was at a counter protest against the anti-Israel Nakba Day protests in London a few weeks ago. And I went and spoke to many people on the other side, on the protest side. And I asked them what they were doing there, and they just said, "Israel. We hate Israel." And I said, what's the problem with Israel? They couldn't answer it. They didn't know. It wasn't something. And they talk about from the river to the sea, but they don't know what that means. They don't have a clue what river it is or what sea it is. I've heard people talk about apartheid. Well, explain what the apartheid system is. No idea at all. Huge numbers of people.
So it's sort of a herd mentality, though, isn't it? Especially on the left. I think there's this sense that, I said this to someone recently who considers themselves more on the left. Well, I said that it feels like people on the left are much less accepting of divergent views politically. It's almost like they from the set menu, whereas my experience has been that people on the right are often more willing to let you choose from the menu, and you might agree with them on some things and not on other things, but they won't necessarily ostracize you. And a lot of these people that took on this anti-Israel position passionately and virulently during the last couple of years since October the 7th have now just switched to being pro-Iran, which is utterly inconceivable in terms of logic, because they're in favor of a tyrannical, theological, Shia Islamist regime which tortures, imprisons, kills its own people. And never mind that there are British citizens currently hostage in Iran. And yet they see no contradiction in it because Israel, right?
Well, I think I said it before, that anything Israel does is wrong. Israel is illegitimate. And it can't do anything that's right. Doesn't matter what it is. it can't do anything that's right. And that's such a widely held view. And you look at what's going on, the horrors that are taking place as we speak in Sudan, the horrors that took place and still to an extent are in Syria, other countries around the world. Where's the protests against that? Where's the uprising? Where's the mass rallies for Sudan, for Muslims who are being killed in Sudan? I haven't seen it, but maybe a few people standing outside Downing Street occasionally. But it's all about this focus on Israel, and it emanates from religious hate. This is not a war about land. This conflict over here is not a war about land. It's a war about religion. And Islamic doctrine tells you that if any territory has ever been under the sovereignty of Muslims, it cannot remain under the sovereignty of anybody else. And you have to fight to get rid of that sovereignty. And of course, Israel at one point was under Islamic sovereignty. So it has to be recovered. It's a religious conflict. And people talk endlessly. And one of the things that you hear, you'll never hear the word Israel mentioned by someone like Keir Starmer or David Lammy. You'll never hear it mentioned without two-state solution. That's all. That's the obsession that they have. And even, and I'm sure whatever the latest statement that's been made about this conflict, two-state solutions come into it somehow, despite the fact that, first of all, a two-state solution in the wake of the 7th of October is an impossibility. It's simply impossible. How could Israel possibly accept that? And there was a two-state solution attempted. Gaza was effectively its own state, and Israel. And look what happened as a result of that. How could any kind of semi-intelligent person think you're going to recreate that situation by expanding it into Judea and Samaria or the West Bank, which is going to make it multiple times worse? And the second point about it is that the Palestinians do not want a two-state solution. British politicians may want it. The Palestinians don't want it. Polling has shown a significant drop-off for any kind of support for a two-state solution. The number of times that the Palestinian leadership have been offered their own state, going right back to the 1930s, and they've never accepted it, not once. They've rejected it every time, which it must tell you something.
In fact, I just had a piece recently in The Spectator about this, which is that the idea of accepting two states is a reward at this stage for the terrorism that was carried out on October the 7th. But you said since October the 7th, I would say, and I'd like to know if you think I'm right, that actually October the 7th proves that before October the 7th, it would not have been appropriate either, because that was the pinnacle of an ideology which did not believe in coexistence. It was not, it was called Al-Aqsa floods. The aim was to get to Jerusalem effectively, rather than to get better living conditions or to see, lift any kind of regulation on what goes into Gaza. It was a manifestation of an ideology which is very mainstream in Palestinian politics, wasn't it?
Absolutely was. And what I meant by what I said was that it's become so stark since the 7th of October that it couldn't possibly occur. But even before that, it couldn't occur because the Palestinians didn't want it before, as proven by their rejection. And the Israelis couldn't allow it. I mean, there were many Israelis who wanted a two-state solution, probably some who still do, but they simply couldn't allow it because they would have to maintain security control over those territories. They would have to do that. They couldn't possibly, even if suddenly, miraculously, the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian people want to live in peace with a Jewish state. Iran didn't want that, and various other influences around the region didn't want that either. And it would have been suicidal to allow it to happen at any time before or after the 7th of October. Israel would have to maintain armed forces in those territories, and they would not be able to allow proper armed forces to exist in a new Palestinian state. So that really means it's not a state.
In a sense, the conversation since October the 7th should have become clearer in that, and it hasn't. It's become ever more one of denial. But I think you hit on something very important there as well, which is that Israelis had this conversation often, both in society and in political leadership level of negotiating for two states and coexistence. But it turns out that was a conversation they were having with themselves. And we've talked about a lot of things Israel got right. But don't you think really they got that wrong? For decades, they've been entertaining this idea that if they just did X, Y, or Z, they will end up with two states. Everybody knows, we used to hear, everybody knows what the final status solution will look like. Everybody knows where the borders will be in the land swaps. Everybody knows. Turns out everybody didn't know. Were they deluded? Were they kidding themselves?
I think there was a combination of things there. One is, many Israelis, I think, and I've had lots of conversations about this, particularly before the 7th of October, many Israelis kind of had this almost utopian idea that if we can give them what they demand, then we'll be able to all live in peace. We won't have to have this huge army. We won't have to have these periodic attacks against us. And they really thought that was the case, probably who hadn't thought it through too carefully, but they thought that. Then, of course, there were other elements who kind of paid lip service to the idea of a two-state solution for political expediency, because, of course, Israel has to live in the whole world, and there's so much pressure from outside, from countries like the UK, from the US many times, and pretty much every other country demanding a two-state solution. So, okay, let's say we're going to work towards a two-state solution, and it'll keep them quiet. And then there were others, I think, certainly others I've met, who understood the reality. You can't ever have this. So I think it's a kind of combination of reality and in a way, delusion.
I used to enjoy seeing you pop up on the BBC News to talk about the analysis you had from your position of experience in these areas. I haven't seen you there recently. What happened?
Well, it's interesting because I do the odd interview on the BBC on pretty much anything except Israel. And they won't let me talk about Israel. They will never invite me. Sometimes I can surreptitiously sneak a bit in about Israel, but they don't want my perspective on Israel. And there's a reason for that. And it's a very good reason from their point of view, which is that they've used me a lot over the years. The BBC has used me a lot as a kind of so-called military expert. And therefore they have kind of suggested that they give credence to what I say in my views. But if those views are diametrically divergent on their really pet issue of Israel, then it would be ridiculous to have me in, because how can they have this guy that they portray as an expert and he's contradicting their views? So they don't do it. And I think one of the last times not the last time, but one of the last times I did an interview on the BBC, which was about Israel. I made the case I made, and the presenter, this was on BBC News Channel, the presenter's answer to me was, yes, but you're Jewish, which I'm not. And I couldn't really say, well, how dare you accuse me of being Jewish? And I couldn't really say, yeah, I am Jewish. So I came up with what was quite a genius answer, which I didn't think of. I remember it from somebody else, Mark Twain or some famous person saying it. I don't have the honor to be Jewish. But the reason they put that question to me was they had to somehow undermine what I said, and that was the only thing that they could think of at the time.
So it's not really Colonel Richard Kemp, it's Colonel Shlomi Cohen.
Exactly. And it's the same with Sky News. I mean, Sky News, I think, their agenda on Israel is every bit as bad as the BBC. Okay, you can argue that they're a commercial organization, so whatever agenda they might have, they have. But they also basically cancelled me on Sky. I used to do a lot of stuff on Sky until Israel became more prominent. So,
I mean, it is a commercial station. One of the commercials I see most often on Sky is before the weather every so often. Do you know what they say? Sky News weather is sponsored by Qatar Air.
Okay. Just to finish off on that, I do think that the BBC, Sky is a slightly separate issue, but the BBC is our national broadcaster. We all have to pay for it, whether we like to or not. And they have an absolute duty for impartiality and the truth and honesty. And they breach that so very often. I mean, you know more about this than I do, I'm sure, but there's so many different occasions when they breach it. To the extent that I think a few years ago, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, they have a league table of anti-Semitic organizations. And in this league table a few years, number 1 was Iran, number 2 was Hamas, number 3 was the BBC.
You know, I've written a lot about the BBC, especially on Israel and Jews more broadly. It's not always even about Israel, that they're breaking their own rules or getting things drastically wrong from what appears to be a position of ideological fervor, not even error. I do wonder, though, we've talked a lot about how politics has got a problem, how parts of society have got a problem, how the media have got a problem. I think we could probably add to that without much exploration. I'm sure you'd agree with me that even within the National Health Service, there's a degree of this within trades unions, within education, universities, schools, even the police, we're told now by many. Civil service, many of them being told, well, if you don't like our government policies on Israel, resign. It does seem hard to find areas of society other than the residents of Colonel Richard Kemp in the UK that don't have this problem. So 2 things. One is there a chance you've got it wrong? And 2, if not, how are we going to fix this?
Well, I've not got it wrong. I'm very happy to admit when I make mistakes, and I make mistakes every day, but I'm not wrong on this issue. What I would say is that I think the 2 elements of society that have not been at least as badly infected by this, and in one case, I don't think infected particularly at all, and that is the armed forces. And I think the armed forces recognize, obviously there are elements of the Ministry of Defense that see it differently, but they recognize the reality of what Israel is doing in Gaza or in Iran, wherever it's doing it, because the people in the armed forces have fought the same kind of war against the same kind of people repeatedly, and they see what Israel's doing, they understand why they're doing it, and they agree with why they're doing it. And secondly, they know how much benefit they get from Israel. I mean, we can impose a partial arms embargo on Israel. It is important. It's both politically important, but also practically important for Israel or damaging, shall I say, for Israel, that doesn't happen. But we are by far the net beneficiary of any exchange or any arms trade between the 2 countries, by far. Britain provides some technologies that are of use to Israel. Israel provides complete systems like anti-armor or armor protection systems, for example, that are vital to the UK. So the people in the armed forces recognize this, and I would say with very, very few exceptions, and there are exceptions, but very few exceptions, serving and retired military people that I have spoken to about Israel share exactly the same opinion as I do, with very, very few exceptions. And the second structure in British society that I think probably is not been infected is the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. They work extremely closely with Israeli intelligence, have done for many, many years. The relationship is probably, I would argue, probably the closest relationship that our SIS has with any country other than the United States. And again, it's because they share the similar problems, and they also gain, both sides gain from these relationships. But I would say that our side gains probably more than it gives from those relationships.
How can we stop it being this guilty secret of those 2 very important and influential parts of society and turn it into something that political leaders or ordinary members of society are more confident to declare their support or understanding or empathy and sympathy and support for Israel?
Well, I think it's, a lot of people are involved in what, for want of a better word, I'd call Israeli activism or Israeli, Hasbara, whatever you want to call it. In other words, putting across into British society, putting across the truth and the realities about what's going on. I think that has a limited effect. It's important. Even if you're not going to actually win this battle, it's still important to fight the battle. But I do think that, there is probably being unduly optimistic. I do think there is a possibility that this particular conflict now, the conflict with Iran, I don't say it'll be a turning point, but it might show some people the reality. I'm talking about maybe the political leaders and other people who are influential in society. As in the past, when Israel had to attack the Syrian and the Iraqi nuclear programs, strongly opposed at the time, but later recognized as being very, very important for all of our countries. And I would expect that will be even more amplified after this conflict. Now, I don't say, like I said, I don't think it's going to be a turning point, but it could be some form of influence. And likewise, I think after the conflict is finished in Gaza, it's a very different situation, obviously. But when the truth begins to come out about Gaza and what's happened in Gaza, then again, that might be instructive to some people, because what we're working on at the moment is a huge anti-Israel propaganda campaign full of lies, tissues and tissues of lies, and a lack of understanding and insight. But when that begins to be examined in retrospect, I think a different story might emerge.
It's that idea that once something's gone well or once something's a good idea, everybody says they always agreed with it, I suppose. And I agree with you on that. I think that down the line, and probably not even that far down the line, if things go well, a lot of this criticism could be forgotten, except while that works for most ideas, I'm not sure if it will work for Israel, do you think? Because the animosity, the disagreement, the fervor is so extreme, it's almost like a religion. I mean, in some respects, in some parts, it is a religion, you've said. In others, it's almost like a religion. You've been in Gaza during this operation, and we hear constantly from the likes of the media, BBC, even Piers Morgan, people like that, well, if they won't let us in there, it's only because they don't want us to see what they're doing. They're desperate to get in there after the war and find the worst. So why have you got that faith that actually it won't just get even worse afterwards?
Well, there will be some bad things they find, but they won't be as bad as they're being portrayed now. And I think one factor will be the huge destruction. Don't forget, but not taking into account the civilian deaths that have occurred there, but the huge destruction across Gaza. It may emerge, and people may understand once they do get in there and maybe have it explained to them and see it with their own eyes, the extent to which Gaza has been turned into a hardened military base. And with every building, virtually every building, not necessarily every single one, but many buildings, most of them, not only used as weapons stores and tunnel entrances and exits, but also heavily booby-trapped, streets booby-trapped, all of these things done. And so, okay, you go into a house. I've seen houses in Gaza where there are boxes of grenades under a child's bed, racks of rocket launchers in the kitchen cupboard, all of this sort of thing. So you go into the house and seize it, but you can't do that because you're then putting soldiers' lives unnecessarily at risk. So the solution is to blow it up. And I think when these sort of facts begin to emerge, if they do emerge, then I think people might have a better understanding. But I'm not overly optimistic, I have to say, that particularly Gaza is going to be a big turning point. But I think the one thing that so few people understand, and I don't know how you make them understand it, because I go back to what I said at the beginning, that the narrative is that Israel is an illegitimate country. If there can be a way of making people understand that it isn't an illegitimate country, that it has sovereign rights from the river to the sea and has had those since 1948, that's the kind of narrative that needs to be overturned. And I don't think even Israel is at all good at explaining that. And until that idea that Israel is illegal occupiers and Israel is illegitimate, until that is somehow resolved, I don't know how, as I say, then the narrative is probably not going to change at all.
I think that while people are willing to believe things like 14,000 babies are going to die tomorrow as a claim, or the day after tomorrow, when it's so patently not even a feasible idea, I can't see how facts will help get in the way of those sorts of beliefs, which seem to me to be a commitment to actual Jew hatred. Again, it's the idea that, well, given the jihadists of Hamas and the Jews of Israel, we've got to believe one of them is doing ghastly, horrific, bloodthirsty things. So the automatic response is that the Jewish state did it, even though they have provided the evidence. You said they've shown us the tunnel entrances in the homes. You didn't need to be there yourself in Gaza as a journalist to see that. They've demonstrated it all. So I do wonder if you're right, if we can beat that ideological opposition and dream fulfillment, fantasy almost, that some people seem to have, that yes, Europe oversaw 6 million of you dying, but we don't have much sympathy anymore because now you're doing it to others. It's almost too convenient, isn't it?
I mentioned before that the government, the British government, doesn't necessarily pay attention to facts and reality when it's making comments about Israel. If you think back to the beginning of the war with Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine, the British government under Boris Johnson made a very clear and strong decision to stand with Ukraine, and that has persisted. But he knew, and the government knew, that we were going to pay a price for that. We were going to pay an economic price. We were going to pay a price in the sheer amount of aid, military aid and economic aid we sent to Ukraine. And therefore, there was a big effort, a major cross-government effort to explain why, a propaganda campaign in effect, which was very, very effective, and I think won over probably the majority of the British people. That same campaign, I'm not saying it could be, but should be applied to the Israel situation now and in the future. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that Britain should become a kind of, the parrot of Israel, not for a moment, but it does have a responsibility to ensure the truth gets out about Israel, because if nothing else, because of the dangers to Jews in the UK of the lies being churned out and the lies being repeated and turning into various different forms of Jew hatred. So that I believe is a responsibility of the British government, which I don't believe it is likely to discharge.
Well, hopefully more politicians, the government may take your lead and start to be more honest about these truths and start to lead rather than follow the people of the country and give them what they need to know. And I'm grateful to you for talking with me, but also for all the work that you do, because I think many who are supportive of Israel and many in the Jewish community don't see you as pro-Israel as such, but they see you as pro-truth and pro the British values, which are at threat that Israel is defending here. So thanks so much for talking with me today, and hopefully we can meet again next in better times, either here in Israel or in the UK. Thanks very much, Richard Kemp.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.